I want to welcome our next speaker, Stephen Kinzer, who writes for the Boston Globe, if you can believe that. Stephen Kinzer is one of those few historians and journalists out there who remind us where we've come from and where we are at. He writes the stories behind the headlines, and he keeps us informed and keeps us on track. So please welcome Stephen Kinzer.
Thanks so much. It's great to be out here with you and feel like there's still some energy, and I feel like in a way things might be moving in our direction. Let me talk a little bit, just briefly today, first of all about how we got here, where we are now in the Ukraine war, and where we might be going. First of all, how did we get here? This is a war that was imposed. This war did not have to happen. There was no reason for this war. All the President of the United States had to do a couple of years ago was stand up and utter one sentence. Ukraine will not join NATO. That would have prevented this entire war. We are chewing through an entire generation of Ukrainian men in order to determine where is the border with Donbass. But for the Americans, it's about something more than that. We can hear U.S. senators cackling on the record about how wonderful this war is because so many Russians are dying and no Americans are dying, as if the Ukrainian lives are worth nothing. In 2015 and 2016, Western powers came together with Ukraine and Russia and signed what was known as the Minsk Accords. They made perfect sense. There was going to be a neutral, non-aligned Ukraine. There would be United Nations-sponsored referendums in disputed provinces. And this seemed to be a way out. So just about 6 months ago, somebody walked up to Angela Merkel, who was the German leader who signed that Minsk Accord, and said, "What happened to the Minsk Accord? Why didn't you comply?" And her answer was amazing, even to me, and I consider myself not so naive on these issues. She said, "We never intended to comply with it. It was just intended to give extra years so we could pour more weapons into Ukraine so the war would be bigger when it started." And then a reporter in France went to visit the person who was president of France at the time, Hollande, and asked him, "What did you think about what Merkel said?" And he said, "It's all true. We agreed. Let's sign this agreement, but we'll never comply with it." So even I was taken in by that one, and I can excuse for Putin for having been taken in as well. So this is a war that was brought about largely by America's innate, profound, deep need for enemies. We're always in search of enemies, and now we've got some great ones. We love to build them up and make it seem like the whole world is surrounding poor little United States, and we're always the victims. We only have to go out and defend ourselves. So this is a war that is going on mainly to satisfy the lust of people in the West, and particularly in Washington, to bleed Russia. It doesn't have anything to do with Ukraine. I can assure you that the people who are promoting this war in Washington barely can find Ukraine on a map. Ukraine doesn't interest them at all. They're just a pawn in a larger geopolitical struggle. Let me tell you, I lived in Nicaragua all during the 1980s as the New York Times correspondent there. And I watched something just like this. Nicaraguan kids killing other Nicaraguan kids in order to play out a global conflict. The people that are fomenting the conflict are not suffering. It's the kids on the ground who are dying and their families that will never again be intact. So, where are we now after we've allowed this war to explode? In Washington, the mantra of "as long as it takes" is still very powerful. Nonetheless, I don't think that's so true out in the general population. You know, I feel like I've watched this movie before. I watched this movie in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It always starts the same way. We are told that the entire future of human freedom on Earth hangs on victory in this war. So we get very excited, we pour a lot of money in, then people start dying in huge numbers. We begin to realize that our ally is not the golden ideal that we thought. It drags on, and then people begin to wonder in the United States, why are we pouring our treasure into foreign treasuries, given all the needs that we have at home? And I think we're seeing that here in America. The last CNN poll showed that 55% of Americans oppose the provision of more weaponry to Ukraine. Now that change of opinion has not happened inside the Washington Beltway. The population is changing its mind on this issue, as well it should. Now, I want to talk about two institutions that I think have failed us, and that will bring us to the question of where we're going in the future. One is an institution that I sort of represent, and the other is an institution that you sort of represent. That is the press and the progressive anti-war movement. I think both have performed poorly. The press is in a shameful state. Only opinions and articles on one side of this issue can appear in your newspapers. No dissent in any serious way is possible in the mainstream media, and there's hardly any exception to this. I feel like I'm living in the Soviet Union when I'm reading the entire monochromatic coverage day to day about the unprovoked invasion and the brutality of the invader and the innocence of the victim. But the progressive anti-war left has also not spoken up enough on this issue. There are too many people who like to say, well, it's imperialism on the other side, and we've always been anti-imperialist. But the key here is not for us to come up with the ultimate solution to the war. The key is to end the fighting at this moment and then begin negotiations and diplomacy. That's what diplomats are for. Now, I started out by talking about Russia's motivations. And I asked my friends this question: how would we feel if Russia or China opened a military base in Tijuana and placed nuclear weapons there? This is what Russia is facing. NATO wants to build a base right on Russia's border armed with nuclear weapons. Would we say in America, well, Mexico's an independent country, even though the nuclear weapons aimed at our cities are only a few miles away from our border, we're not going to do anything? We wouldn't do that. We can't tolerate that kind of a threat on our border. So place yourself in the shoes of people on the other side and try to answer that question of how you would feel if the shoe were on the other foot. And then I ask one other question. And that question is, what is so awful about a non-aligned Ukraine? Ukraine is perfectly placed to be the bridge between East and West, rather than a piece of territory that the East and West fight over until every Ukrainian is dead. So there's actually a model for this. I want to take you back to a little historical episode, and I'll finish with this lesson. After the end of the Second World War, occupying troops did not leave Austria. Austria was occupied for 10 years after the end of the war because both sides wanted it inside their sphere of influence. That dilemma was finally solved with something called the Austrian State Treaty. Austria agreed never to join a military alliance, never to have foreign troops on its soil, and to incorporate these promises into its constitution. Austria has done great since then. It doesn't threaten anyone, and it's not threatened by anyone. This should be our model for Ukraine. I feel that the job for you, people who are active in the anti-war movement, has to be to try to educate your comrades in all of these domestic social justice movements that have sprung up over the last decade and are doing such powerful work. I admire what they're doing, but I always see a big hole in their argument. And that is, they don't make the connection between our failure to serve our own people at home and the massive amounts of money we are spending on wars abroad. What we need to do is to understand that there's an answer to that question, where are you going to get the money for that? That's what you always hear. We want Medicaid for all. Who's going to pay for it? We want free community colleges for everybody. Where are we going to get the money? Yeah, I have the money. I have $800 billion in the Pentagon. I want people working on social justice movements to make this connection so that our movement to try to end the carnage in Ukraine is understood as not simply a foreign policy project, but it's also a project aimed at turning the United States into the model that we all want it to be. It wasn't very far from this spot in 1630 when John Winthrop got up and said we wanted to be as a city upon a hill. Let us devote our efforts to transforming our society so we truly are a city upon a hill and not build bombs made to destroy hills in other countries. Thank you.